Hello, everyone. Welcome to In Plain English, the podcast that is all about making science approachable, open source, and jargon-free. I'm your host, Jamie Moffa, and today is a very special episode. This episode is the recording of the live show that I did last month in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania with the community for Rigor. It was a fantastic discussion about how we can improve rigor in scientific research, and I had such a blast recording this. I really have to thank Community for Rigor for setting this up and for coordinating all of the logistics and finding the guest speakers. Kaela and Arjun were really phenomenal. So you all are in for a treat. Without further ado, here's the episode. Right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. As Caro said, my name is Jamie Moffa. I am the host of In Plain English, which is a science communication podcast that is all about making science approachable, open source, and jargon-free. We will try our best to do that today. I am a little bit more about me. I'm an MD PhD student at Washington University in St. Louis. I started this podcast almost exactly 3 years ago, so super exciting to be here kind of like on the third anniversary of doing this. And I am joined by Konrad Kording, who is with the Community for Rigor. Konrad, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, can you tell the audience a little bit more about yourself, who you are?
Yeah, so look, I'm a computational neuroscientist. I analyze data. I collaborate with lots and lots of labs across the world. And for a long time, I've started to be more worried about how we operate as scientists.
Yeah.
And it started with me sometimes seeing experiments where I was worried about my own outcome. And let me give you an example of that, like, because that motivates why we're here, why I care so much about that. So we were doing this project where we wanted to figure out if someone has Parkinson's disease based on how they were moving that was measured on their phone. If we could find out if someone has Parkinson's disease based on that, that would be really, really useful, because you could only do the early diagnostic, warn people like, look, maybe you'll get Parkinson's disease, maybe you want to be more physically active, all that. And I had a postdoc working on it, and the results got better and better. And at some point of time, we felt like we were almost as good as real doctors at diagnosing Parkinson's disease. And then I did something that maybe I shouldn't have done. I had this would have been a great paper, right. Scientists diagnose Parkinson's disease based just on phone data. That's a great, great, great story. Only then we get, and it was a small study, 50 people or so. Then we get another 50 people, and what worked on the first 50 didn't work at all on the second half. And so I was like, wow, there's something really broken in the way we've been doing things. And what had happened, you try a thing, then you try another thing. Is it better? If it's better, then you go with the new thing.
Right, yeah.
And we had been doing that for a long time, and that's why we get so good. And that's kind of one of these eye-opening experiences for me. Yeah. So C4R is at some level me trying, and as a community, us trying to make it less likely that we make mistakes like this.
Yeah, so can you talk a little bit more about Community for Rigor and kind of what you're all about?
Yeah, so we understand that we're kind of in that situation where a lot of things we do in science lead us down the wrong path, make us come up with the wrong conclusions. And mine was just an example. If people try to replicate research, oftentimes research doesn't replicate. If people try to ask a question, then often the paper they write, even if it does replicate, doesn't really answer the question.
Right.
So there's all these ways how the logic of science has problems. And so Community for Rigor is basically us coming together and deciding, let us try and be better. Let's try and come up with conclusions that we can more believe in.
Yeah, I mean, that's so important with all the reproducibility crisis that's going on. And part of Community for Rigor's mission also is educating people on really basic concepts. So what you were talking about earlier I understand that's maybe something called p-hacking. So maybe if we want to ask the audience, how many people know what p-hacking is?
Yeah, who knows p-hacking? Okay, wow, we have an audience with a lot of people knowing about things. Who knows what's the file drawer effect?
Fewer people.
Nice, but like a good number of you know about it. So the reason at some level why we're here is when I was a student, no, I had never heard those words. So I wasn't aware of that. So when I was a young professor, I told my student, okay, come on, try this other thing. Maybe that gets you significant results. So at some level, and if you do that 20 times, you should get p smaller than 0.05 and hooray, publication. But I didn't have that awareness because no one taught us.
Right.
So the vision behind C4R is kind of, it's something we should talk about, not like that we should learn about, and we shouldn't learn about it in terms of this is how you get published. We should talk about it. We are here because we want to do great science.
Right. How do you find out real things about the world and make real advancements?
That's why we're here, not like we're making half as much as a lot of people in our community make half as much that they could make in industry, because it's just so unbelievably awesome to learn about how the universe works. So we better be sure about what we learn about the universe.
Right. We'd better actually know. And to talk more about scientific rigor, I would love to invite to the stage Kaela Singleton and Arjun Raj. And thank you both so much for joining us here today. I'm going to start out just by asking each of you a little bit about yourself. So let's start with Kaela and then Arjun. Tell the audience a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Kaela. I'm a Black, Samoan, queer developmental neuroscientist by training. I'm currently the Director of Grants Management at the Cure Alzheimer's Fund, and I'm currently the president of Black and Neuro, which is a nonprofit organization that seeks to diversify the neurosciences. My background is in developmental neuroscience. I got my PhD from Georgetown University. I did a postdoc for a couple of years, and then being a PI just seemed really hard and not fun to me anymore. And so I left and I started doing more nonprofit and community building work. And a lot of that work has dealt with issues about reproducibility and rigor, but also how do you get buy-in from people to build new communities and to start new practices and to do hard things and to have difficult conversations. And I think that's it. That's all I got.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. And Arjun, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm Arjun Raj. I'm a professor here at Penn in bioengineering and genetics. I run a lab that studies molecular systems biology, so basically trying to build quantitative pictures of how the genes in our cells work together to create organisms. I've had a long-standing interest in rigor and reproducibility because I'm a scientist and that's supposedly what we do. I would say that, as time goes on in science, for me, as my career keeps going, more and more I feel like these are really important issues for us as a community to address. So happy to talk about them.
Absolutely. And so I think to start off that conversation, Konrad talked a little bit about why we are here, why we're doing this panel. But I want to ask you all, why are you here? What brought you to be interested in rigor and reproducibility to the extent that now you're doing a live podcast recording about it?
I think at some level, a small part of it is just because I was asked to do it. And I was like, oh, that sounds so much fun. I would love to go to Philadelphia. I've never been. But I think at a bigger level for me, much to Arjun's point, part of being a scientist, what was interesting about it to me was the idea that we were all working together to solve similar problem, or to solve a problem, and that in order to do that, our data needed to be rigorous and reproducible, and that we would all be able to work together. And I think as I advanced through my career, I saw that was not really possible, even sometimes within my own lab, within our own department. And so that's always been really interesting to me. And then I'm always interested in how communities are built. I'm always interested in how we have accountabilities in community and the structure and how we can reshape and reimagine how we do our jobs and what the incentives are for us to be more rigorous in our research. And I also think for me, a big part of talking about things like rigor, which is like such a rigid word, obviously, it like deserves more whimsicalness. Like, it doesn't have to be super serious for us to like talk about how our data are reproducible. Like, we can have some more fun with the things that we do. And I'm always game to be fun in those moments. So I'm really just
That's why we want you on stage.
Yeah, yes. That's why I'm the comedic beat for the podcast.
Yes. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's, okay, I can pinpoint one moment. Published a paper. This was early on. I was like a student or postdoc. And someone said, hey, really love your paper. Send me an email. Hey, really love your paper. Can I see the data for this? I'm interested in something or other. I was like, sure. How did I get that again? And I think at the time it wasn't a thing that anybody would ever question.
Yeah.
But that moment I was like, I don't like this feeling.
Yeah.
And I don't want to feel like this again.
Yeah, you kind of feel like you've been called out, right?
Yeah, and it was all fine, and I think, those were perhaps friendlier times. But I was determined to put in place systems for, myself and my own lab moving forward so that I wouldn't have to feel that way again. And so I put a lot of thought into, the pros and cons of it. I think that a lot of the current discourse is very much like the pendulum is swung towards reproducibility at all costs.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we have to think, well, how much is that cost really? And what is the toll that it's taking on us as researchers? So, I think that's also a part of this problem that I'd love to discuss.
Yeah, good science is often based on playfulness. So how can we simultaneously be rigorous scientists, but also play with ideas and kind of be there as the people that we are?
Yeah, I think I was chatting with Kaela a little bit about this last night, about creativity, how can we think outside the box? Because she said something that was really cool, which is that in a lot of respects, the rules are kind of made up. So we can make up our own rules that will lead us to better science.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite lessons in adulthood. As I become more of an adult, I'm like, oh yeah, I can make up the rule. I'm in charge of this little sphere of life, and I can make up the rules within it. And I feel like, I don't know. I don't know if that's a feature or a bug of the way that science is set up, in terms of you have your postdoc, you take your postdoc work and then you start your own lab, and then you just take practices from before to create this new environment. But to me, I think there should be more creativity in terms of the rules that you get to assign, in the process of even how you keep data or store data. In my grad lab, there was just a cold room that was just filled with old data. It was just a 4-degree room that was filled with boxes. It was horrible. To go in there was my worst nightmare. And by the time I left, we had like cleaned out that room and like come up with a new system or process, but it took like all 6 years of grad school to convince the whole lab that that was a good idea. So.
I wanted to maybe also give an example of bad rigor formalizations. No?
Yeah.
At some point of time, people agreed that P is smaller than 0.05 should be the standard to publish. At first, it sounds wonderful, no? Because it enshrines a certain standard of statistical data strength to publish. So in that sense, you could say it could have been a force for the good because it makes it less likely that we fool ourselves. But instead, it became this thing where if you get P smaller than 0.05, you're good, like publish.
Right.
And then people started tinkering with it until it was smaller than 0.05. And so in the end, I'm not sure if it in the end had good or bad influences.
Yeah.
Enshrining.
Yeah, no, I was chatting with a friend about this recently because, I'm in the process of publishing a paper and it's been accepted. Yay. But, thank you. One of my findings, landed right on the correct side of P equals 0.05. And it had like a lot of other supporting finding, like I believe that it's correct. And I was like, what would have happened if it had landed just on that other side of P less than 0.05? Like, would I still be able to publish and convince reviewers that like in the context of these other findings, I think that this is real? Or
would I have had to, maybe I'll just throw in a couple more replicates until it is on that right side of the line, which is, not rigorous. So I think that brings me to asking about it is sometimes really difficult to do the correct and the rigorous thing, as much as we want to bring some creativity to it. So I wanted to ask about maybe more personal stories. When was a time when you found yourself butting up against it would have been easier to do something maybe a little bit less rigorous?
We had an example, this comes up all the time because I think especially in molecular biology, there's a habit of only showing the best data and hiding all the things that didn't work for whatever reason.
Yep.
And I don't mean that to sound, I think, malicious, but it's a thing, right?
Yeah.
And, we had some data and we had a bunch of replicates that were kind of messy. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently, especially in the last few years, has been okay, well, do we really have a reason to exclude this data that's independent of the result? And I feel like that simple maxim could solve a lot of problems.
Right.
And in this case, the answer was no, and we just put it in, and fortunately, nobody gave us a hard time. There have been other times when we've been rigorous and reviewers raise concerns, and it leads to trouble for us. I don't know how to square that particular circle, but I to these ideas of sort of playfulness versus rigor, I think there is always this sort of a balance, right? Because, you don't want every time you come up with a new idea, let me multiply my P by this, multiple hypothesis test. I was at some sort of faculty mentoring discussion thing, and there was an older scientist there, and he was talking about pre-registration, which is, for those of you who don't know, the idea that you kind of write down what you're going to do ahead of time and what the conditions are for success or failure or whatever it is, put it in a box, then do it, and then come back and you held to that standard. And he was talking about this, and I was so opposed to it. I was like, this is against exploratory science. This doesn't make any sense. And he just kind of smiled and was like, think about it.
Yeah.
And I could not stop thinking about it. I came out and I was like, yeah, he's got a point. And I've been trying to incorporate that more and more as just a mode of thought in the lab. How far do we want to go? We're not at the point where we're putting it in a safe and taking it out after, which I think would maybe be a little stultifying. But I think this balance between the joy of the job and the rigor of the job is something that we have to consider as we have these sorts of discussions.
And I think that's part of the mission of Community for Rigor, where what we want to get people to understand is all these factors that matter for rigor. And while it's not about dividing the world into two halves, that's the good stuff and that's the bad stuff. It's more about, if you tried 50 things, you will eventually get pretty good, unless you have a very, very large number of subjects, which we're trying in some of our studies now. And there are many factors to that where you can bring up the rigor. And I think we really want people to be able to reason about it. And the other thing, and that's why I'm so happy that you're doing the podcast about it, I want people to talk about rigor. I've done wrong things. Everyone who's been in the field for a couple of years has done wrong things. And it's wonderful if you're now in a group where people that thought a lot about it, and you ask people who has done this rigor mistake? And you see all the hands come up. And so I think we're all making these mistakes, and we need to learn to talk about it and try and become better at it.
Yeah. Well, I think earlier Kaela brought up something about accountability, and sometimes that word can be very punitive, that if you did this rigor thing wrong, you should be punished. You'd have you have to submit a correction to your paper, have it retracted, blah, blah, blah. And that's not going to get anybody to want to admit when they've done something wrong. So how can we have accountability among scientists that's not
trying to punish scientists when they make a mistake.
Yeah, I think that's a part of like the community part of community for Rigor, right? Like, how do you agree on a shared set of principles and values? And I think this goes back, in my mind, a lot of the times to like how we develop solutions for problems. I think a lot of the times when I talk to people about like a solution to something like Rigor, or really any problem, they're looking for like a one-to-one relationship where like there's this is the problem and there's only one correct answer for how to like fix that. And I think that is very rarely ever the case, much like your example, like about like pre-registering studies. There's like a way to do that still allows for the flow of creativity, or like there's one idea that we can all iterate off of and expand upon to like fit our needs, but also fit the different types of science we do, right? Like, I'm a molecular and cellular biologist by training, and so I too have sat in front of the Western blot machine and just like begged and just like tried to figure out what was different between this experiment and the last experiment. And it's like in those moments when I would go to like more senior grad students or postdocs in the lab, that they would like, those would be the most earnest conversations we would have about reproducibility and Rigor, where they're like, yeah, this has happened to me before. Like, have you tried this? Have you tried that? And so I think the like idea of accountability to me is always rooted in community building. And even in systems, like when we talk about open science and we talk about journal publications and retractions and things like that, I can't tell you the number of like papers I've seen that have like retractions, or like, what are they? It's like a little follow-up paragraph where they're like, just kidding, we put in the wrong figure. And you're like, cool, awesome. But like sometimes I never see that, like unless I go looking for it to be like, was there anything weird about this paper? And so it's like, how do we have a lot of these conversations without shame? And I think in order to do that, we have to really interrogate like who we are as ourselves, like leading labs, being in labs, mentoring other people. And I think that there's a very human side to that I don't think we all, or the university really loves for us to like delve into. Mainly because it's messy and it's hard and it's not really the standard of practice that everybody is looking for. But I feel like, to Konrad's point about an earlier story, it wasn't until I was in my postdoc lab that my PI was very much like, no, show me all the data. Like, show me the statistics that didn't work, show me the blots that were crap. Like, let's talk about, like, let's follow the science where it goes. Like, if this didn't work, then what are we missing? And that was probably the most fun I ever had in science, because I felt like nothing I did was wrong. It just like was what it was.
Yeah, it's all a part of the story. So Arjun.
Yeah, I mean, I really wanted to follow up on your point about the punitive nature of it, and how people feel like in the dark about. I mean, you know, when we talk about our justice system and society, we often talk about, you know, punitive versus restorative. And I feel that in science, especially these days with, you know, the effects of social media and so forth, it's very punitive, often without any due process.
Right.
And I think that is really dangerous, and it encourages people to want to cover things up, because I mean the repercussions are sometimes completely out of line with what actually happened. And I think if we adopted a more restorative mindset, like, okay, well, how do we do better?
Yeah.
People will make mistakes, and I feel like the more we're penalizing people in really harsh ways. I was just talking with someone, and I was like, this is both ridiculous and targeted.
Right.
And our current climate is very much like that. And I think that we need to really take a bit of an assessment period to decide how we want to adjudicate these things in ways that I think are more productive and encourage discussion.
Yeah, I think that's like a double-edged sword to places like Twitter, right? Because it can be a really fun way, or I guess Twitter, we all love to complain about Twitter, but it can be a really great way to share your science with a large audience in a less formal setting than a journal club or publishing a paper, right? But it also encourages black and white thinking about what is good science and what should happen when people make mistakes. So yeah, like maybe following up more on the community side of that, how can we build communities where we can still share science and talk about scientific ideas in a way that's more informal and more just sort of like chatting with our colleagues, but that doesn't create this mob mentality about like, you know, you did something wrong.
I feel like there are a couple of like organizations that do that. So like Arcadia Science has their like own version of like open access science and preprints, and I'm pretty sure they stream them. I never watch the streams. I do just look at the tweets, but they like talk about the papers that they're looking at with the critical lens. It is like a journal club vibe, but they open it up to like anyone who's interested, and they do all kinds of work. I'm just remembering they have someone on staff who's like a cheese biologist, and I think that's really cool.
A cheese biologist?
That's not the point of this. There are other groups too, like Pre-Preview or ASAP Bio that have their own. I think a lot of these things are all revolving around like open access science, which I think is like the future and the key to how we talk about science more colloquially. But I do think the like good and bad thing about Twitter is that it did give us like an open forum to get to know to communicate with one another quickly, but it does obviously have as much nuance as like a brick wall. So it's hard.
And a lot of people that are into scientific rigor get to know one another on Twitter. So I think in that sense, it's been essential. I wanted to bring the question a little to Kaela. You're building communities like super successfully, and you shared your attitude towards scientific rigor. How are you infusing like your communities with that way of thinking?
I think the cool thing about building community with Black and Neuro is that it is like driven by, we get the benefit that like our community is really driven by like the influx of like new grad students or new undergrads, and young people have such, not that I'm not young, but like young people have such energy. They have like such enthusiasm for things. And so I think a lot of the times what they see when they join our community is a space to like share their ideas and be very authentically themselves in the way that they ask questions and not feeling like they look stupid or that they're like doing a bad job. And so we try to be very like supportive in that. I feel like the ways that we talk about rigor and reproducibility, at least in like the mentorship circles that we have, has always been around like what is, for me, it's always like writing based. So it's like, what is grantsmanship? And like, what are we writing in our F31 fellowships that is doable and not doable and also a little hand wavy? And what does that actually mean for like the project that's getting done? And I think sometimes people have that training and sometimes they don't. And I don't know, for me, it's always just about being like concrete and explicit about the expectations and then the potential outcomes. But then it's also for me about like not tying your like self-worth to like whether or not you get funding or like to your job, if that makes sense. Like that you are a good person, even if like this experiment fails. That's like always the first lesson that I actually try to teach everybody because it's a hard lesson to go backwards. But.
Yeah, honesty and openness in a way push you into the right rigor direction just by itself if you just openly talk about your concerns. And
I talk a lot about like working out loud, whether that's like in, it's because I'm a grants manager now that everything I do is like writing based, whether that's like in documents where I like, instead of like giving a very polished comment, not as bad as like when my grad school mentor used to just write a whole bunch of question marks next to like a sentence that I wrote, but where I'm like, what did you mean here? Or like, what do you think about this? And so it's about like showing people how I think about science and them showing it back to me and us having this sort of dialogue about, I don't know, what's next.
I mean, one of the things I try and do is just, within at least the domain of my own lab, is just any result is okay. You are okay.
Right.
Like it's fine.
It will be okay. Everything will be fine, and we'll figure it out.
That is so important.
I think that's one of the things that just as a signal to say like, you can share what you find. And I hope that it sets a tone where people feel like they can openly share what's working and what's not working, because a lot of the time it's not working.
Right, and then you can find some actually interesting information from that a lot of the time. I was going to ask the two of you, since you're professors, I'm very much coming at this from a graduate student perspective, but you're in a position where you like mentor a lot of younger people, and like you with the like reviewing grants and everything, how do you create that atmosphere within your own lab that encourages your trainees to be like rigorous, open with their science, to really approach it with a lens that doesn't have this shame in it?
I think a lot is just trying to be really clear and open with one another. Like, what would it mean for you to feel that you showed something? Mm-hmm. What is the logic of, and it's not just about statistics. We always talk about statistics. It's often that the paper at the end claims one thing and the logic doesn't quite get you there. So a lot of it is I just sit down and I view the logic of a paper as just something it's not something anyone should know. It's more something that you poke and that you're like, well, what if about this piece here? What about that piece? And I think it's just like being open towards questioning all pieces of the science.
I mean, one of the things I do is just try and, as I was saying, encourage any outcome as being like, okay.
Yeah.
I also just ask people, like, if this result came out the other way, would we include it? And if the answer is yes, then you have to include it no matter what. It's just like simple things like that that really make to put it in concrete terms. The other thing that I emphasize to them is like, it's okay if it doesn't all fit.
Right.
Every paper is going to have a few loose threads or something that, doesn't make sense. And maybe that drives something forward, or it was an artifact or something. I mean, it's almost like, if you do 20 experiments, it's like that works in the other direction too, I think, where sometimes stuff just might not work. And it's okay to do the best you can as long as you're honest about the limitations. And I also try and emphasize that, at least within our confines, that's not punitive. Like there's like, oh, this was bad. It's not bad. That's just what is, and we'll write about it the way it is. And then, the outside world is something that is sometimes forgiving and sometimes not. And, there's only so much we can do about that except put out our own, hopefully, positive energy towards it.
Yeah.
Oh, I think, and for me, I think when I mentor students and when I was in grad school too, a big thing for me was always being honest and realistic about the timeline, because really in my deep-rooted graduate student mindset, my biggest quibbles with rigor and reproducibility came when I was like, but I need to graduate. Did you know that I so desperately have to leave Georgetown University, great institution sometimes, but I have to get out of this Western Blot room or I'm gonna cry. And so a lot of I learned with my PI to be more explicit about what the timeline is and what the experiments are, and to I don't know, there's obviously a sense of urgency that happens in graduate school, but to be, my grad school PI was really great at assuaging me that the world was not going to end if I didn't graduate this May specifically. And she was wrong sometimes, but having conversations about what does this set of data that does not look good, or does not go with the hypothesis that we're trying to build in this paper, if this goes wrong, what does that mean for me and my endpoint, which is to get this degree and go home? And I think sometimes having those kinds of realistic conversations too are really important, where it's what is the time aspect of this? And that doesn't make it not assigning moral judgment or value to it. It's not bad if I've got to spend another 3 months doing this, but being realistic that it's going to take another 3 months.
Another thing that I think helps in my lab a lot is when we write papers, and this is something that every lab can do. I always insist that we have a weaknesses section in the paper. And this is where you say, would have been nice if we had pre-registered that, but we didn't. And basically put these concerns that we have ourselves on paper. And I never found that really hurts papers in the review process, but it matters for us because we know that we shouldn't trust it. It's not time to build a startup around that idea that we just found in a non-pre-registered study where we tried a few things. And it helps produce clarity. And it helps produce a culture of like openness and truth in a way.
Yeah. I think also I would love to see more of that sort of thing, or more results that didn't quite fit in papers, because it can be such an interesting follow-up. It can be something that someone else grabs onto and is like, that was weird. Why did that happen? And they can run with it. Then your paper gets cited by people who are looking into this weird finding that you had. And B, now someone else is going to follow up on this loose thread. And I think this could be an issue, I think it is good to think of your paper as a story because it helps you communicate it. But in some ways, it's bad to think of your paper as a story because a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's all wrapped up by the end. And that's not how science is. Science is more of a like living, breathing endeavor where there's always going to be new findings that don't quite fit with what we thought before. Because if all the findings fit with what we thought before, why are we doing science?
No forever after?
No happily ever after in science. There's always more to do.
I mean, one of the things I've found is, especially when I was starting in the lab, we would start a project based on some paper, and it'd be like, and then discover that I don't think that's true. And then I'd go talk with people and they're like, oh yeah, I couldn't get that either. Or, oh yeah, that nobody believes that. And I feel like there is this community aspect which is very informative, but informal.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're like, is this rumor? Is it not?
Yeah.
And it would be great to figure out ways to shed a little more light on those inconsistencies. Because sometimes it's like a whole field is like, this thing never really works. And nobody outside knows about it.
And no openness to disagreement. So I found that if you have fields that do that, if you then write a paper which says, well, we tried replicate, it didn't work, and my friend also tried replicate, it didn't work, it's very hard to get these papers published because everything comes from a place with this illusion that all the published papers must be right because they're by important people in important positions.
This is one of I think we need to bring back like old school science beefs in this way, where one of my favorite stories from my grad mentor, it was like the finding of tangential and radial migration happened at the same time. And like both scientists whose names I should know, but don't anymore, they're very famous, were just like going back and forth in journals about how the other one was wrong. And they were like showing all this data to be like, no, see, they move tangentially. And then this other guy was like, no, they move radially. Like, what are you talking about? We could do better than this. It did take them years to like decide that it happened both ways. And I don't even think it was the two of them. It was a third person who was like, and what if you're both right? But some great work to read if you want to just read like two grown men really going at it and being like, well, this guy's a moron. See, look at the paper. Like you can see with your eyes. It's fantastic. So that's my suggestion, I guess.
Yes.
But it wasn't necessary to call the other person a moron.
No, sorry.
No.
It's funny now. I'm sure the tensions were very high then.
Yes.
like a disagreement is good, but we should still have beers afterwards.
Yes. Yeah. I think also this maybe brings us, like talking about the meta aspect of science brings me to something that I think about a lot, which is that we can have all these really great ideas for like, how do we change the culture of science? How do we make science more rigorous? But it takes actually a lot of work to just get people to the point where they will actually do that. Because, if you've ever tried to get more than 5 people to do one thing at the same time, I don't know how that's worked out for any of you. It hasn't worked out very well for me. So like, how do we build community? This is part of this community building thing, and organize people around the idea that we can do things differently.
I think for us, it always starts on some form of like, you have to sort of give people the space to air their grievances, and then you have to sort of challenge them and like teach them too how to use their like creativity muscles. Like a lot of the times when I see things that I don't like, both like in science but also like in society, I'm like, what would I have done differently? And it takes me a while to sit and think about like the actual tools, whether that's like money or resources or whatever that I would need to like fix that problem. But I try to be as like concrete as possible with my solution, where it's like, if the rules are made up and the points don't matter and money is no object, what would I like really want to see? But that's like, it's like a muscle you have to flex, and it's like a thing that you have to learn to do. And I feel like you do it best when you're with other people and you're sort of like working together. And so it's, for me, a lot of the times it's just about finding people that you feel free to communicate with that way. And because there are like some people that I'm not going to have those conversations with because we're going nowhere, or we just like simply disagree, like we don't agree on like the end goal. And so for me, it's about like giving people a space or a forum to like say their spiel, and then us working together to be like, how could we make what is your solution? And then iterating off of that as much as we need, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think a lot about it is also about the stance. Like scientists often, when they get into these extreme beefs, it's what they're missing is the realization that the other person, based on the data they've seen and the thoughts they had, is trying to do the right thing. Like they're wrong, but they certainly are certain that they're right. And not only that, but they have their heart in the right place. They want to do the right thing. It's just the assumptions they make get them to the wrong place.
Actually, a lesson I learned, I think, early on, I learned it from a postdoc that came to the lab, really brilliant guy, Gautam. We spend a lot of time on our ideas that are exciting, like trying to think up, wouldn't it be cool if it worked this way? Mm-hmm. And one of the difficult things is to spend as much energy and enthusiasm asking, what if it didn't work this way?
Oh, that's impossible emotionally.
That's very hard to do. Yeah. Gautam was the master at this. In fact, we called it the Gautam transform, his ability to take a cool idea and show that it's actually something really boring. And
it's so hard, don't you have that? Like we fall in love with our ideas.
That's part of our training. I mean, I think there's a push in a lot of the rigor and reproducibility world to think of it as like a bunch of boxes you can tick and checklists and whatever. And those have their place, no doubt. But on some level, it's about thinking about alternative hypotheses, thinking about your controls, thinking about pre-registration, things like that. There's just no substitute for it. And it's not fun. But I think we just have to acknowledge that you just have to think about the alternatives as hard as you can.
I think, yeah, maybe even if you don't have a big beef with someone where you're like writing back and forth in journals, maybe imagine in your own head or get someone else who's like in your same department, but maybe not in your lab, to play the role of person who's beefing with you. Like if someone disagreed with your hypothesis so strongly that they would write to Science about it, what would they say? I think that would be it's like a role-playing activity.
I can give you Gautam's number.
I'm sure I would be...
Flash it on the screen behind us.
Distraught to learn that all of my cool ideas are in fact boring and lame.
I will say with Gautam, it was an interesting experience having him in the lab, because I think, it was when other people would tell him their ideas, they were perhaps a little reluctant. But he was such a kind-hearted person. Yeah. Like you knew that he's giving you this critical feedback because he really cares about you. He wants you to be doing the best you can, and he's really doing it almost like a service, which is a hard lesson to internalize. And, not everybody can pull it off. Mm-hmm. I think as scientists, these days especially, we're very prone to dismissing destructive feedback. So people give you some tough feedback at a conference, and they say it in the worst possible way. Right. And then it's like, oh, that person's just a jerk. Yeah. Get that bully out of science, whatever.
Right.
That doesn't mean they're wrong. And I think that we also have to grapple with the fact that, you have to be able to engage with feedback that's not going to be how you like it. But nevertheless, you can use that to do better work.
Yeah.
And we need a good culture for that. So on Twitter, for example, for a long time, there was this argument that immediately killed any discussion, which is if a senior person disagreed with the paper of anyone, there's always at least one junior person on that paper. And then it's you senior person are saying something mean to a junior person, which is problematic, and therefore you shouldn't. And I recently ran a poll on Twitter where I asked people, well, would you like people to actually criticize your papers? And people want their papers to be criticized. It's just that some people use this to make it into a power game of sorts.
Yeah.
I don't think people want their papers criticized. Whatever they say.
No, I actually agree. I don't think most people are good at sitting with feedback and taking feedback, myself included. It takes me like a really long time to process this kind of like I just have to, and it's like I do have to the solution is that I unfortunately have to read the feedback multiple times. Like first I have to read it and then get offended. This is all on my own time, obviously. I read it, I get offended, I feel bad. I come back to it later and I'm like, okay, maybe there's a point or two in here and they could have been a little bit nicer. And then I sit with that, and then I come back to it again, like completely neutral. I'm like, oh, they actually didn't say I was an idiot. They just were like, where's the control? That's interesting now that I've read it 3 times. But I also think that that's a part of building community is teaching people how to take feedback and how to both how to take feedback and how to give feedback, because I do think that there is some power dynamic, some people do go on very big ego trips when they give feedback. And I think in my time working in open science and trying to develop rubrics for publishing and feedback, one of the biggest things that we always heard was that senior PIs felt like it would take them more time to be nice and give feedback, to give kind feedback, as opposed for them to just be really grumpy when they first go through it. And for me personally, I always just go through the paper twice. I go through it once and I'm very grumpy, and I go through it a second time and I go, how could I have maybe said this nicer, or could I just include a paragraph at the end that's you did a really great job. Doesn't look like it, but you actually did. It's just me. And so I think that goes back to Konrad's point about there's a human nature to all of this, where it's what voice am I giving the person? What am I projecting onto them?
Right.
That we still have to grapple with all of the time. But I actually do agree. I don't think most people really want feedback because they don't know what to do with it.
And we should all be better at that. But here's the thing. When I get a horrible review for a paper, I'm not sure if I'm the only one. I sometimes write these super nasty responses to that. And then I don't submit them. And then I edit them. And by the time they're submitted, they're positive and constructive and all that. But at first, it still hurts to get that feedback.
It does. I think this is such a fantastic discussion, but I also want to open it up to the floor. There's a microphone over there because we do want your questions to appear on the podcast, but please bring your questions to the microphone and let us know what you want to ask.
Thanks for being here. This is really cool. I was excited all week about this. I wanted to ask you, I love that you're doing stuff in your labs to sort of help your students feel better about, maybe not quite getting P is less than, 0.05 or whatever, right? But can you talk about how you envision reconciling the sort of bottom-up approach versus this more systemic pressure, journal reviews, also universities who want to see their professors produce a lot of work all the time and get grants? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so there's clearly the incentive problem. Now you can say shoddy science could be published faster, therefore there's an incentive. At the same time, every generation brings their own idealism. The reason why we're all here in this room is because we care. And the reason why we care is because we do science, because it's just really exciting and we want to understand how things work. So I think we are in this contrast between them. And I think this is where our center comes in. Now, C4R is basically to make it easier for us as scientists to really understand which things can be problematic and how problematic, and get an intuition for all of that. Because I think this idealism is always there. And I think we just want to empower ourselves to be good at harnessing it. And I think if people talk more about rigor, then everyone gets more rigorous and the standards will be adapted to it. And it is a little bit, if people are really egregious on the not being rigorous side, and we all know examples of that, then I think in the world as we have it now, there's much more that people kind of say, like, really, we wish you would do this in a different way. And I think C4R is really just about empowering people to go there and make those points.
Yeah, I think also something that I've been thinking about is that, like, science is political a lot of the time, especially when a lot of it is funded by the NIH. This is funded by the NIH, which is great. It's very, very excellent that they care about scientific rigor. But also, when the government doesn't fund science, it's hard to do good science. So yeah, a lot of the times it does intersect with these very top-down structures. So I think, from a graduate student perspective, doing the most that you can within your lab, and then also taking whatever opportunities that you have to talk to the people at the very top that are making these decisions, and get a group of people together, because they'll listen more to a group of people than one person, and say, like, it needs to be different in order for us to do good science.
I am very much in favor of the bottom-up approach, because I kind of feel like, look, nobody as a kid was like, I'm going to grow up and fake big discoveries. I think fundamentally people get into this because they're interested in truth and science. I think the problem with the top-down approach, I think it's all very well-intended, but I think it ends up creating a lot of bureaucracy, and which would even be fine if it achieved the intended effect. But I don't think it usually does. I've found that an example is, and often I think very loud voices tend to have an outsized effect on policymakers. So, like, for instance, now in many journals, they don't allow bar graphs because some loudmouth on Twitter is like, oh, you need to have dots, and why are you hiding the data? And I'm like, bar graphs are fine.
Right.
But it's an example, I think, where, people making policy perhaps are responding to the wrong thing and creating extra work or hurdles that I don't actually think really help the science, or if they do, in a very minor way. And I think that, I think working from the ground up is, in my opinion, a more sustainable and lasting and effective approach.
So I see the bar graph thing different. I see it as a bottom-up thing where a couple of scientists said...
A couple of scientists.
Yeah, a couple of loud scientists talked about it. And there's, like, literally no downside of replacing the bar plot with give me the rain cloud plot. There's no downside that I see of showing all the data. So I think it's actually like a positive change.
But people can disagree, right? That's the problem. But now it's enshrined as policy.
It doesn't, from my perspective, it doesn't cost anyone anything.
From your perspective?
I mean, like,
I think it comes at a lot of readability cost. And there are a lot of things where it's like, you got, CRISPR's no less important because it was a bar graph instead of showing the dots.
Yeah, I think it comes back to also, like, there can be more than one solution for the same problem. The problem being, like, if you show a bar graph, sometimes it can look really misleading what the data was. Shows, especially if you have, like, a huge N, you get these really teeny tiny, like, confidence intervals in this really dramatic looking graph. Whereas if you have all the dots, maybe it looks less dramatic, but it's not always the right solution. Like a rain cloud plot or whatever kind of plot you want to have is not always the right solution. It has to be catered. So I think I see your point about there being, like, sometimes these top-down, like, policy mandates make things harder because they can't foresee when there's going to be, like, these cases where it's actually not the right thing, and maybe a bar graph would be the right way to display this data.
I think that goes back to your point about, like, the different checkboxes that, like, sometimes people's solutions to these answers just come in the form of, like when you have to fill out a conflict of interest form, and all of a sudden you're, like, questioning every person you've ever talked to. It's really stressful for me, actually. And I think I don't know. I can say like my 2 cents on this, which is that like I as a person am an abolitionist. And so for me, it's very much like the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So like, how can we use these bottom-up approaches to make something different and make something new? And then like gain enough momentum to become a completely different thing. So I feel like C4R does that in a great way. And I feel like there's a lot of community-based discussions that do that. And I also think that there's power in labs or departments running in a way that like is in parallel to journals, kind of, if that makes sense. I think there's this idea that like the standards that we set for ourselves within our own individual community, like obviously we have to publish, so we'll publish and we'll do that. But like the community that we're cultivating in these spaces is more important than that measure of outcome. And I know that that's a bit idealistic, but I think it's a good place to start. And I think it also allows people to dream bigger and be a little bit bolder about the things that they want to see. And it allows people to disagree and then find like their niche for like people who agree with them in that way.
Absolutely. I think we have one more question probably we have time for.
Yeah, I was actually just going to make a distinction maybe between bottom up versus top down and tool versus leash. Like I think around the time that the Landis paper came out, like back 2012 or whatever, NINDS made all their big rigor changes about the importance of bias removal in general and transparency. There was a paper from Oz Stewart and Rita Ballas-Gordon that really spoke to the need to kind of, as you were saying, like not come at it from a penalizing sort of angle, and to recognize that just like with statistics, like rigor is a tool to accomplish your goals of seeking truth and shouldn't be used as like a cudgel or hugely restrictive. Like every project is going to be different, have a different balance of exploratory and confirmatory science, and that some bottom-up things are bad, some top-down things are going to be bad if you come down from the wrong angle, but some top-down I appreciate only because it's in systems like science, just like, capitalism's a great innovation engine, but if it's unregulated, it's going to run hot and kill everything. So it's the regulation from the NIH to focus more on the rigor of previous work that's informing your grant. Like, I think that was a good move. And it's not really too hardwired into study sections and reviewers. I think taking the angle of guidance is better for NIH, and then journals obviously, or at least, higher tier journals have a lot of checklists and things now that you have to go through that can be a little cumbersome, but overall will usually fit your project if it's moved beyond an exploratory phase. And if it doesn't, there's another journal that will fit your project as long as it was done from an honest place. So I think that there are a lot of beneficial top-down, beneficial bottom-up, but also probably more likely to get negative top-down because it is always a little bit less organic, and no matter how many conversations you try to have to inform those kind of measures. So I absolutely agree with you there. But I think there are some examples where it can be beneficial as long as it comes from the angle of this is a tool. This is going to make rigor easier. As you said, it doesn't need to be rigid or cumbersome. We can develop tools to make rigorous science more easy.
Well, and I think there's a difference too, right, between how do we survive in the system that we're currently in, and then what is the difference between survival and like making something anew, for sure. Like those are like, I don't know, they can be connected things, but there is something to like, we're talking about like envisioning a new future, right? Like how we're constantly re-envisioning postdoctoral training, but like just on paper, not in practice. How do we do that? Like for this, like what are the practical steps that people can take? And I think that that's important too, like to make those distinctions.
And I think the really important thing are the conversations we're having. Like as soon as we start talking about should we have bar graphs or not, as we start talking about should we build the community this way or that other way, at that point of time, we are using our thinking to make things better. So it's these conversations that we need to be having, and that's what we had today.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So thank you all so much for being here. I hope that you've enjoyed this first ever live show. I'd like to thank Konrad Kording and Kaela Singleton and Arjun Raj and the Community for Rigor folks, Carolina Garcia, Thomas, I don't know your last name, Zach. Sorry.
And our entire audience here.
Yes, thank you all so much. I hope you all enjoyed that special episode of In Plain English. Once again, the panelists were Konrad Kording from Community for Rigor, Kaela Singleton, and Arjun Raj. Behind the scenes, Carolina Garcia, Zach Parker, and Thomas McDonald from Community for Rigor were helping to coordinate everything, set up logistics beforehand, make sure all of our travel was set up, coordinate the sound and the room at Penn. I would also like to thank the University of Pennsylvania for their hospitality and for hosting this event. It really went off pretty much perfectly. So thank you all so much. As always, you can find this and previous episodes on our website at inplainenglishpod.org. Our logo is by the wonderful team at Biographics. That's Jessica Higginbotham, Tania Lintz, and Yolanda Campos. Our music is by Sam Brunwasser. You can find more of his work on SoundCloud at Visuals Now Beats. And finally, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Plain English Sci so that you never miss an episode or exciting news and updates about In Plain English. Again, that's PlainEnglishSci. Thanks once again for listening, and come back next time for another episode of In Plain English.